Kenya's domestic debt saw another increase in the month of May. Kenya's domestic debt rose to a record 3.6 trillion shillings as of 28th of May 2021 from 3.63 trillion as of the 30th of April. We're looking there at the domestic debt holders, everyone from commercial banks all the way to state corporations holding the domestic debt of East Africa's largest economy. The value of Kenya's horticulture exports rose sharply in the first quarter of this year. According to data from the Central Bank of Kenya, horticulture exports jumped by 30% to 39.4 billion shillings as at the end of March 2021. Kenya exported about 179 tons of horticulture in the 3 months through March 2021, 36% more than it exported in the same period last year. Tea, coffee also climbing as well. Joining us from Nairobi to discuss further is Kalta Kiptiony, Development Management Analyst with Centum Investment Company Plc. Kalta, thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon to you. First question, President Uhuru Kenyatta's administration poised to borrow more to fund an 8.8% increase in spending. Is the spending justified at this point, Kalta?
I think you could argue that it's justified. First of all, thank you for having me on. On paper, you could argue that the spending is justified. I think President Uhuru's government has been very big on infrastructure spending, especially, and they have a big four agenda that is very capital intensive. So on paper, the additional spending you would say is justified. However, the biggest concern is whether these funds are actually spent the way they should be. For instance, just to take one example, has been the SGR project, which has been sort of a legacy project, the Standard Gauge Railway project that the government has been heavy on. So they did the first phase from Mombasa to Nairobi, and it has been operational for a while. However, in terms of generating returns, it hasn't been that good. However, in this budget, there's still more that has been allocated for the expansion from Nairobi to Naivasha, and there are question marks on whether such a spend is justifiable. So it's really not that straightforward. On paper, yes, it's justifiable to develop or to be able to achieve what it is that they want to achieve. But in terms of the actual return in some of the projects, I feel, in my own personal view, I feel like there could be some reallocations that would be more impactful to the economy.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you about debt servicing. Kenya's debt servicing costs are set to rise by about 22% in 2022. Are there any legitimate worries about being able to service debt?
Yeah, I think debt service is a legitimate concern at this point, especially the external debt, which is it's sensitive to changes in the interest rate. So, for instance, the past year, the Kenya shilling depreciated by close to 10%, and for every percentage decrease or depreciation in the shilling, then it leads to a subsequent increase in the debt servicing costs, purely because of the exchange rate depreciation. So there has been a legitimate concern, and this, I think, was seen with the IMF especially coming on board with a facility, three-year facility to try to support the government, especially in its debt repayment and fiscal debt stabilization, which caused a lot of, I think there was a lot of uproar when IMF came in at that time, but IMF having to come in shows that there's significant and considerable risk in terms of debt repayment.
I guess, we have the domestic debt holders there, commercial banks, insurance companies, and so on. Same question. As far as, I guess if you're concerned about debt servicing, you're also going to be concerned about its rising domestic debt as well at 3.67 trillion shillings in May. Is that, I guess, that also a concern for you? Or if the fact that it's domestic debt, which I guess they could print their way out of that, is that less of a concern?
Yeah, I think domestic debt is not that much of a concern for me. As you've mentioned, if it comes to the worst, then they'll just simply print. For me, I think my bigger concern is the holders of the domestic debt. With the graphic that you showed, you see that commercial banks hold 50%, more than half of the total domestic debt. For me, I think commercial banks should hold lower, and some of these funds that are in government bonds should actually go to businesses and enterprises and people to try and support them. Because what we are seeing in action is an element of credit rationing, where instead of giving money to the people, it's going more to the government. And I think that the private sector is in dire need of credit facilities, which they are not able to receive because banks are holding a lot of government paper.
Fantastic. Kenya is betting on a strong economic recovery to narrow its deficits. What do you make of the bet? The IMF is projecting a 5.5% growth for the Kenyan economy in 2022. So what do you make of the bet on the economic recovery and the IMF projection as well?
I think naturally, because of the pandemic, because there was a contraction in the economy, naturally there's going to be a bounce back. And so I think the 5.5% is achievable in the next financial year, because generally the economy, as it continues to expand and continues to open up, especially for Kenya, we've been having a curfew since April last year. So the curfew has been changing or modified every time, but at the moment it's a 4 a.m. to 10 p.m. curfew. So there's a number of sectors of the economy that are still closed up, which especially the nightlife. So you have your nightclubs and your bars that are still not operational. So hopefully, as time goes and as the economy continues to open up, then we'll be able to see that bounce or that expansion as projected.
All right. Fantastic. Great stuff. Speaking of economic recovery, according to data from the Central Bank of Kenya, horticulture exports up by 30% in Q1 2021. I think we had the data there with tea, coffee, and so on and so forth. How encouraging is that with the climb in horticulture exports?
I think it's very encouraging. I think the government made a smart bet earlier last year when I think there was a government initiative to send flowers to the National Hospital Services in the UK, when everyone was applauding the nurses there as part of the appreciation to the work that the nurses were doing back then. The government sent out a shipment of flowers to the nurses and doctors with the National Health Services in the UK. And I think that gesture of goodwill kind of translated later with more demand for the horticultural products, especially from Kenya, which has kind of, I think, helped boost the horticultural exports recently. So I think at the time there was a lot of backlash to the government because the citizens were concerned that more focus should be on COVID preparation and making sure that it won't be devastating to the citizens. But in terms of as a play on its own, I think it has had some good payback.
Great stuff. How important are tea and coffee exports to the Kenyan economy? I think we've got the numbers for those numbers rose as well. How important are they?
Tea and coffee they're very important to the Kenyan economy. Tea and coffee specifically contribute, or generally agricultural exports especially, which includes also horticulture, contribute a significant amount of Kenya's next export earnings. I think should be around 65% thereabout. So they're very important export earners for the nation. So seeing them doing well is good. It's good for the farmers locally, and it's good for the country as a whole.
Fantastic. I want to talk about another metric, business sentiment in Kenya. I'm showing a PMI reading from Standard Bank of Kenya for the month of May was about 52.5 points from 52.5 points in May from 41.5 in April. Is that encouraging to at least, I guess, cross the 50-point threshold as far as business sentiment is concerned? It is because when the threshold crosses 50%, then it means that
the economy is expanding, that there's an expansion of output, there's an expansion of economic activity compared to the previous period. So crossing that 50% or 50-point mark is very encouraging. And I think that just shows how important it is to open up the economy. In April, we had government-directed lockdown of select counties in the country, which included Nairobi. This was done to try and to curb the spread of COVID in the country. And that meant that people couldn't travel into and out of Nairobi, for instance, and some of the other bigger towns like Nakuru. And this had a big effect, especially on the transport sector, for instance, retail as well. It had a slowdown. So when this directive was lifted and now people can travel throughout the country, this was lifted in April. We've seen now the bounce or the improvement of the expansion that has been seen in May. So hopefully, as we get to open up, then we get to see more and more economic activity.
Great stuff. You were talking about curfews a few minutes ago in Canada, that's still in place, put it in by President Kenyatta. So talking about COVID now, do vaccination rates in Kenya factor into your outlook on the economy?
I wish I could say it does. Ideally, it should, but I think there's been a big concern on the management of public funds allocated especially to COVID fighting and vaccinations. So we could see in the budget, for instance, in the financial year that just ended, there's around 7.8 billion shillings. I believe that was already appropriated for COVID. And within that time, only 2% of the population has gotten vaccinated, and that is just receiving the first shot of the vaccine. So in this new budget, there's been 14 billion shillings that has been allocated. So if you are to do quick math based on the history, it means that even with the 14%, if they do it the same way they did, with the 14 billion, if they do it the same way they did, that means that just an additional 4% that's going to get vaccinated, which is 6% total, is pretty low. So at this time, I wouldn't say that COVID vaccination attempts forecasts or plays a part in the forecasts, but I think the key metric that I would look at is the positivity rate and the number of people who are succumbing to COVID. I think that is what is more important because if the number, and we've been fortunate enough that the number hasn't been as devastating, if the number is stable, then I think you could make the wager to go ahead and open the economy and have things going back to normal.
All right, Kalta, we got, I guess, less than 30 seconds. What are you folks at Centum Investment Company telling your clients as we move into the second half? Briefly, if you can. 20 seconds.
I think at Centum, we just are very optimistic about the economy. We believe that things are looking up. We are seeing the end of the tunnel. Vaccines are going to come through. People have been resilient, and we believe that the economy is going to open up. There are big pockets of opportunity in real estate, in private equity, and I think there are good opportunities in the market that we can take advantage of. Yeah.
All right, fantastic stuff. Kalta Kiptiony in Kenya, analyst with Centum Investments. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights on the Kenyan economy.